Hello, everybody. Welcome to tonight's edition of From the Boardroom to the Locker Room. And I've been waiting to chat to Andy Capostagno, a rugby correspondent and a good mate of ours here on From the Boardroom to the Locker Room, because I'm interested to get his thoughts on a couple of issues with regards to rugby matches that have happened, and then just briefly touch on what's coming up as we are going to be starved for a while of test match rugby till the tour in the UK or the other tours around the world at the end of the year. Andy, hello, welcome. Nice to chat.
Hello, Louis. Yes, lovely to hear your voice.
And yours too. Right, let's start off, shall we, with the best of all. What a performance by Russie's Springboks in Mbombela after a bit of a hiccup, I guess, and a missed kick in front of the post, or relatively in front of the post by poor Mani Libok, who took absolute hell from social media and then played an absolute blinder in Mbombela. I think we kind of now starting to see the Tony Brown influence and the genius, which we've all known, of Rassie Erasmus in making sure that we have a team that I guess is going to go on and hopefully conquer the world again in the next World Cup final.
Well, it's looking very good 3 years out, but a lot of things can change. I'm pleased you mentioned Tony Brown, because I think one of the things that he perhaps hasn't been given enough credit for is the way that they have rather seamlessly replaced Willie le Roux at fullback with Apelele Fassi. And we've spoken before about the difference between those two players. And for the last two World Cup sequences, Willie le Roux has been an absolutely key player for the Springboks, because effectively he plays second phase fly half, second or third phase fly half, as a distributor more than a runner. Now, with Apelele Fassi, his distribution isn't as good as Willie's, and his reading of the game generally isn't as good as Willie's. But what he's got is the ability to take on an opponent and to identify space that can be utilised. And he had a fantastic game in Mbombela. And the mere fact that Rassie is now trusting him as his starting fullback, at the beginning of the sequence of fixtures, I think we were all just thinking, well, he's resting Willie, or Willie might be carrying a niggle and he'll come back. But it looks to me as if the coaching staff have identified Fassi as the man that they want to go with. And that means that the rest of the game has to change a little bit. So what people are talking about now is how many fantastic tries we're scoring, and that must be from the influence of Tony Brown. But it's not just the influence of Tony Brown, it's the fact that Rassie is prepared to give Fassi his head.
And I guess if you're the coach of the rest of the teams around the world, you're kind of not sure what Springbok team's going to take the park and what style they're going to play, because you can either get that very tight physical up front game, or you can get the wide expansive game, and then you can get the combination of both as well.
Well, the lovely irony of what you've mentioned there is that just yesterday it was announced that when France tour New Zealand next year, they're going to send a second team. And all hell has broken out in the land of the long white cloud, because they're saying they're being disrespected by France. And people are saying things like, well, Dupont is avoiding playing in the Southern Hemisphere because perhaps he's not as good as people think he is. But here's the issue. France are sending a second team to New Zealand. If South Africa sent a second team to New Zealand right now, they might well win.
Absolutely. I wonder what your mates in New Zealand will say if that second string French team does actually beat the All Blacks, because they are sort of smarting, aren't they? Let's just talk a little bit about Rassie and Mani, because, I mean, I take my hat off to Rassie. I mean, the flack that poor Mani Libok took, and then to give him the role in a crucial game to win the Rugby Championship, and then first time the ball gets placed on the ground, he's not the man doing the kicking, but he played brilliantly. And I think his confidence, thanks to not just Rassie, I guess everybody in that management team, to put him in that side and not knock his confidence after the social media, and we're the worst supporters in South Africa when it comes to knocking our players, is but a genius.
Well, I think that what made me smile was that, as you say, the first time the kicking tee went down, it wasn't Mani, and everybody in the ground was waiting for that moment. And it wasn't even a recognised goal kicker. It was Jaden Hendrickson. And I loved the psychology of that, because the Pumas would have looked and thought, oh, well, who the hell is this guy? And how dare he? And of course, shortly after that, they changed the kicker again. I think that's the sort of thing that Rassie dreams up in the bath or in the shower. He just thinks to himself, what can I do that would really upset the opposition? And that was one of those. Now, as much as I've just gone on about how Fassi is playing such wonderful rugby and is the man for the future, I'm not so sure about Mani Libbok, And Mani had a very good game on Saturday. And as you say, psychologically brilliant to not burden him with the place kicking. I think that now that we've got a gap ahead of the postseason tour, that Rassie's going to sit back now and watch Libbok playing for the Stormers and just wonder where he is in the pecking order. He's in the fantastic position where he can pick several players in each position and know that he's going to get a game out of them. Now, I've done Mani Libbok since he was at school, and only in the last couple of seasons has he really played to his potential. Remember, he bounced around between the Bulls and the Sharks, and he's had 2 goes at the Stormers. And personally, I don't think he's the man. But here's the great thing, that Rassie can take almost anybody and make them the man in the circumstances that he gives them to play in.
It's amazing you talk about the likes of Mani Libbok from his school days, which brings me back to somebody you've watched for an awful long time, and so have I. My thought process when Victor Matfield was getting to the end of his career and Bucky's Porter, and we were thinking to ourselves, wow, what a brilliant lock combination. They've been absolutely fantastic. What's going to happen? Now we're 128 test matches later, and between Eben Etzebeth and AN other, of which there could be any, we're not even thinking anymore about what's happened. We're now perhaps thinking about what's going to happen, and the future is a lot brighter maybe than it was when Victor and Bucky's were locking the scrum for South Africa.
And think about the fact that Arche Snyman hasn't really been available this year, and that Franco Mostert hasn't really been available this year, and they could easily be a starting combination when we go on tour at the end of the season, if for whatever reason Eben is not there. And to go back to the record that he has broken, I don't believe anybody thought that anybody would beat Victor Matfield's record in the long term, never mind the short term, because he played for such a long period of time. Remember, he retired as well and then came back to the game. So he could have had a lot more caps than he ended up getting. But here's the other thing. 2 entirely different lock forwards for South Africa. And who's to say who was the better player? Victor Matfield's great gift was his ability to decode line-out calls in real time on the field and make himself an absolute menace for any team that the Springboks came up against. Victor wasn't great at hitting rucks. He was a fantastic broken field player. He spotted space really well, and he popped up in unusual positions. And I loved him as a player. Thought he was absolutely fantastic. I was a lock forward myself, about 57 million times worse than Victor. And Eben Etzebeth, when he first came into the side, looked like he was going to be a replacement for Bakkies because he had that physical presence. But 128 test matches later, he is so much more than just a physical presence. But that is still the core of his game. When he walks onto the field, everybody else in the team lifts their heads up and says, that guy's on our side. We're going to win.
Absolutely. And of course, the partnership between himself and Siya Kolisi, and if I may use in terms the love that they show each other, and I know it's a game of rugby and we shouldn't be using the word love. You know what I mean? I mean, that bond, that friendship, and there was a wonderful photograph on social media of the two of them when they were almost still kids together is just absolutely wonderful. And a partnership that I guess Rassie has a problem, a great one. Who does he choose to take on the end of the year tour now?
Yeah, and as I say, I think he's going to sit back for a month or two and just watch and not to put too many structures in place. He's going to see who's fresh. He's going to have a look and see whether there's any new players coming through. The undercurrent, of course, is the ongoing injury to Sasha Feinberg Mngomezulu, but I saw him on a video just today working hard in the gym with strapping on that knee. And my feeling is he'll be playing URC rugby sooner rather than later, and that he will be part of the mix. He's probably going to have to go into a room alone with Rassie and explain himself, so that going forward they won't have the same issues that he's concealing injuries coming into a game. And so if he comes back into the mix, we go back to that story about that I was talking with Marnie Libok. You know, Marnie's not a better player than Sasha, and he's also not a better player than Handré Pollard. So if those two go on tour, then what role does Marnie have? How big is the squad they're going to take? Remember, they're playing 3 test matches. They're not playing any midweek games, which is a shame. And I suspect that it'll be a little bit of a mix and match squad from Rassie. And he might even, with a little bit of prompting from the English and French clubs, leave out players who would otherwise be absolute certainties to compete. It might be different if we were playing a Grand Slam tour. But they're not playing in Ireland, which in my opinion is a good thing. We've played Ireland twice this year. We know they're a good side. We're going to be playing a Welsh side that is rebuilding, an English side that is always good enough on the day, despite what many people might say, and a Scottish side that is still hurting from the beating that they were given in the World Cup last year by the Springboks. So it's one of those tours where I suspect that Rassie isn't going to take a full-strength squad. But, of course, going back to the New Zealand conversation, whatever squad he takes will be incredibly competitive.
A two-barrel question to you. Is Sasha Feinberg and Mngomezulu perhaps the man to take over from Siya Kolisi? Maybe that should be the second part of the question. The first part of the question, do you think that 1 point loss to Argentina and broke the run of unbeaten matches has given Rassie the opportunity in a weird way to do exactly what you say and not necessarily choose the strongest team because he's not on another run of so many unbeaten matches?
That's a very good point you make, because Rassie, of course, was part of Nick Mallett's team that set the South African record of 17 in a row. And that run came to an end at Twickenham against England in 1998. It was a key moment in the building of that Springbok side, because Bob Skinstad came off the bench in all of those games on that tour. And by the end of the tour, Nick had decided that he wanted to start a test match with Bob Skinstad instead of finish one with him. And that, of course, started the trouble with Gary Teichmann, who ended up not going to the 1999 World Cup. Now, all of that is in the grey matter of Rassie Erasmus, because he was there, he experienced the team dynamic and the way that it broke down in that 1999 World Cup. It's no secret that the players went on strike, and that for the quarterfinal against England in Paris, the idea of the drop goals was a player thing, not a coach thing. And going forward, Nick was sort of put to the sidelines. Now, he came back from that and became the man again. But as I mentioned, all of that is part of the dynamic of how Rassie goes forward from here. And I think that he secretly is not at all unhappy that they lost that game by a point to Argentina. Number one, because it means he can look a few players in the eye and say, you didn't stand up when you needed to, you need to up your game. But number two, because it's a monkey off their back. We don't have to worry about, we lost a game. Same thing with this tour. We could lose all 3 games. We're still world champions.
Exactly. And Sasha, could he be the next captain?
I think that's a long way off. I think Kolisi will certainly carry on next year, and then it will only be a case of his physical fitness. He's carried injuries in the past, we know, and of course a miraculous recovery just to go to the 2023 World Cup from an injury that looked like it could even have been career ending. So I think that he's got plenty of time left in the Springbok jersey. He's going to set all sorts of records as a captain that probably will never be broken in this country. And he is key to the dynamic of the team on the field. You mentioned the love that is shown between he and Etzebeth, but it's the same, I think, with every player on the field. We've gone past that era when people were sort of talking in smoky rooms about how, yes, he might be a good captain, but he's not worth his place in the side. You just watch the way that he's played this year, and you can't come up with that argument anymore. Magnificent player. So we're actually looking at the long term, which is why you mentioned Sasha Feinberg Mngomezulu, who is a magnificent orator and has been since he was a young man at Bishops. The question always with a fly half is, does he maintain his form? Because he will be targeted. And does he come through injury free? Because, again, if somebody's targeting you, you're likely to pick up injuries. He's certainly in the mix. But I think that we're in that situation where almost just as we talk about how any 15 could take the field on any given day, Rassie can do something like say to Salman Murat, who wasn't even part of the squad, your captain this week.
Before we leave the Springboks, I can't not mention Pieter-Steph du Toit. This is a giant of a rugby player.
Isn't he just? Every time he takes the field, he's the man of the match. He never seems to he's always up with play, and then he gives you things that no other player can give you. And we've spoken about it in the past, but I remember doing him as a 19-year-old playing for the Sharks and thinking, well, here's our lock forward for the next decade. We don't need to worry about that. And when he was moved to number 7 flank, I was in the vanguard of people saying, don't do that. Don't be stupid. He's a fantastic lock. Don't play him out of position. And of course, what we've discovered since then is that you could probably play Pieter-Steph at fly half and he'd make a fist of it. An amazing player, amazing man. And for anybody listening who wants to learn more about Pieter-Steph, I must recommend Mike Greenaway's book, The Fireside Springbok, which was my book of the year on cover to cover on SuperSport last year. And there is a wonderful essay on the Pieter-Steph du Toit story in The Fireside Springbok, where it talks about the fact that he is Pieter-Steph du Toit the 7th, and that the family has been on the same Cape farm for 250 years, and that the firstborn boy is always Pieter-Steph. His son is now, I think, 5 years old, and he is Pieter-Steph the 8th.
And I bet he's a monster of a man already at the age of 5. Okay, you gave me the opportunity to segue beautifully into my next conversation by mentioning the Sharks. Are they not the luckiest team you've seen in a final ever? I mean, come on, that Currie Cup win. I mean, how did they get away with what should have been a loss in the semi? It was similar to the Springboks at the World Cup, wasn't it?
Well, just to go back a little bit from that, remember this year, the Currie Cup has rather been an afterthought. Indeed, at one stage, it looked like they were going to cancel the competition. They finally got it together. They played it over a course of 2 months. A lot of the games were almost under 21 matches or players that were serving out a contract matches. When we got to the knockout stages, suddenly the quality of the rugby went up dramatically. And part of the reason for that, of course, was that the URC was on the horizon and provinces had to get their squads ready. So they gave game time to people who hadn't played too many matches up to that point. So the quality of the rugby improved. The 2 semi-finals were fantastic games. And in the final, with home advantage, I think everybody assumed that the Lions would do the job. And on the day, it looked like they would do the job. And one extraordinary kick sunk them from one of their own, from Jordan Hendrickson, who played, I think, 4 seasons for the Lions before joining his brother at the Sharks. And I was watching it with friends at home, and I said, this is too far. He won't knock this one. And of course he did, with an amazing kick. So were they lucky? Yes, they were. But I think it shows the long-term planning behind what's going on at the Sharks because the coaching staff had to do something. They were so poor at the end of last season. Remember, they played in the Challenge Cup rather than the Champions Cup because they hadn't qualified from league play. And John Plumtree is a man that I respect hugely. He will get it right. He had to do a lot of things. He had to tell a number of players who had been part of the squad for almost a decade that their time was up. Now you must go on, find another job, retire, do what you need to do. He had to bring some youngsters in, and I think that he's back in charge and living in the province. I think he's now putting a lot more emphasis on finding local players, which makes such an amazing difference when you get into trouble on the field. When the crowd knows that there are local boys on the field, there's that extra little spring in the step. You feel the roar of the crowd, and it's something that had been lost. Too many players bought in with big money, and Sia Khaleesi would be an example of that, by the way. And too many players brought in on the basis of a good Craven week, nearly all of them from the Cape. So without denigrating any of those players and being sort of almost internally xenophobic, I think what the Sharks must concentrate on now is producing more of homegrown talent, because there's plenty of it out there. You know, I do a lot of schools rugby in KZN, and I see players of all hues playing magnificent rugby on a weekly basis, and that had been lost by the Sharks. And I think that Plumtree will bring it back.
I know it hasn't been lost on you, but I think it's been lost on a lot of people that they had a semi-final and a final away from home in Europe and a semi-final and a final away. All four of those matches, they came from the brink. And I think a lot of that is to do with not only them giving John Plumtree the job, but sticking with him after, as you say, a very poor season, injuries and Sia and Earburn and all the other things that went along with it. And now that is definitely, albeit they lost last week in the United Rugby Championship, which we'll move on to now. But kudos has got to go to them for that winning culture that they've had to overcome away from home.
Yeah, I think the thing about Plum is that there is nobody in the world of rugby who can look at a sequence of results and say, get rid of the coach, because he's obviously not up to it. We all know that John Plumtree is up to it. He knows the game absolutely back to front. And the most important thing about him is he is a really, really decent human being. The number of press conferences that I've attended at Kings Park where the Sharks have lost and certain coaches of the past wouldn't have turned up. He turns up and he shakes hands and he smiles and he tells it like it is. So I'm very proud of the fact that a little bit of humble pie has been eaten by some people at the Sharks, because he should never have been let go in the first place. And we very nearly lost him to South African rugby completely because I think it was probably politics in New Zealand rugby that stopped him from being an All Black coach, which he would have done a magnificent job at.
So let's move our attention now, unfortunately, or fortunately, depends on whether you rugbyed out or not, to the United Rugby Championship. We've had a round with the South African teams, the franchises, who, of course, missed out on their first weekend of derby matches because of the Currie Cup. They've gone away from home. They haven't necessarily had the best start. The Sharks lost, the Stormers lost, the Bulls got away with a good win in the end, and the Lions, who look like a side that could compete this year. Are any of those sides good enough to win it this time round?
Oh, yeah, I think so. The history of the last two seasons shows us that they're good enough because we get a team through to the final. And you read what comes out of the European press and you see the fear. These are full of people who have at least one and sometimes two World Cup trophies in their cabinets. So you cannot take them lightly at any stage. I think it's a really tough ask for South African sides to begin a tournament on tour in Ireland and Britain. And we have to do it year in and year out. And what seems to be the pattern is that things start slowly and then when we get into the sequence where we have home games over a long period of time, then those sides bring their A game and get back into the contest. I don't think that we'll ever see in a URC season something that we saw occasionally in Super Rugby, where one team is just utterly dominant and wins wherever they go. And I'm thinking of a team like the Crusaders between the 90s and the early noughties. We're just a fantastic rugby team that wherever they went, they won. I don't think that will be the case with the URC, and I wouldn't worry too much about a little bit of a standing start from the Stormers and the Sharks. I think the Sharks will be disappointed that I think they were 27-7 up at half time and then stayed in the dressing room. They were awful in the second half. So Plum will have some work to do there, but they'll get there. And when they come back home, they'll be a much better side. Same with the Stormers. John Dobson is a cerebral coach. He will have a plan. And of course, Jake White at the Bulls. Nobody needs to underestimate Jake, because Jake understands the important thing about a URC season is that it is a long way, and the idea that you have to win every game, otherwise you're not going to feature, is not part of the conversation at all.
And it comes on the back, Andy, of a team like the Springboks and South African players who went through every single game in France. They've gone through the end of the year tour. They've gone through the URC through the beginning of this year. They've gone through the tours in South Africa, Portugal, and so on. And then, of course, the Rugby Championship now into the URC. These coaches have got to be psychologically brilliantly able to motivate and juggle squads, because you just cannot physically play so many games back to back.
And something that we perhaps don't understand as well is that it's not just the players who are fatigued by what you've just described, but it's the coaches as well. You can't keep turning up week after week and be expected to inspire and come up with new moves. And that's when coaching squads become as important as playing squads. And that's certainly something that we're starting to learn about in this country. We're still in that sequence where we've moved from Super Rugby into URC Rugby, and we've now combined 2 seasons into one, and there is no rest period. And World Rugby has got to come to terms with that. Somebody has got to grasp the nettle and say, right, this can't happen. There have to be 6-week to 2-month periods of rest time for everybody. And one of the things that was tried last season was putting that rest into the season, and it didn't work. So a committee has got to come up with a plan, because you're going to kill the golden goose the way that things are going on at the moment. And ironically, of course, because we're not part of Super Rugby anymore, we're looking to what's going on over there, and they're playing way less rugby than we are. But here's the thing, they're playing it at a much lower level than when South African teams were involved with Super Rugby.
On that note, once again, I thank you so much for your time. It's always wonderful chatting rugby. And we will again in the very near future. Andy Capostagno, thank you so much for joining us on From the Boardroom to the Locker Room.
A pleasure, Louis. Thank you.
That is tonight's edition. Don't forget, tomorrow evening we look forward to a fantastic sporting weekend, and I will go into the fixtures for the United Rugby Championship in much more detail and discuss, obviously, the Premier League, the Ladies Cricket World Cup that gets underway, and all sorts of other great sporting events, the Alfred Daniel Golf Championship, and, of course, it's the MotoGP in Japan. All that and more tomorrow evening in From the Boardroom to the Locker Room. But for now, as always, be nice to each other. Until next time, bye for now.